Hi guys, back with another discussion of books. I want to discuss the reading of Star Wars books that I've done this year. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I haven't read all of the books by any means. There's, there's lots of them. There's hundreds of them, in fact. If you include the books written for children and teenagers and so on, there's literally hundreds of Star Wars books out there. Now, I only read the full-length books, of course, the adult ones, I guess you would call them. And this year has been a series of winners and losers. The good have been very good, and the bad have been, well, I guess just a waste of time, and just the product of whatever, forces other than, I think, a solid understanding of what makes the Star Wars mythos great. And hopefully, I'm planning a larger discussion video on comparison of the Star Wars idea of the Force, or I should say George Lucas's view of the Force, in comparing it with Catholic theology, or I should say Christian theology. What are the points of intersection, and what are the points of divergence? So that should be kind of fun. But anyway, we'll keep this simple and short, and I want to tell you about the great books I've read in the Star Wars series and the not so great books. Now, there's, once you get into the literature, you're going to discover writers that you really like and writers that you don't like as much. I don't look at it too closely in terms of who are the writers that I like the most and who are not. I just look at it in terms of what's the subject matter. And it's interesting, when I look at my list of favorite books that I've read this year, very often they are books that concentrate on the Sith rather than on the Jedi. Well, that is interesting, that I find more interesting that kind of thing. But it's not an absolute distinction anyway. So here's the books that I've read this year. I've read the 3 Darth Bane books, the trilogy of Darth Bane books. So The Path of Destruction is the first one, and then Rule of Two, and then Dynasty of Evil. I've also read the Old Republic Revan book. Revan, who's often referred to as Darth Revan, but he was only a Darth for a while. He was a Jedi most of his life. But sort of in the most pivotal points of his storyline, he was Darth Revan. I also read Death Troopers, and that is kind of it's almost like a zombie story, kind of like a Star Wars horror story, where this scientifically manufactured plague overtakes a ship of stormtroopers mostly. So it's an interesting story. And I've read in the past, I've read Lost Tribe of the Sith, the collected stories, which was excellent. Darth Plagueis, excellent. And one of the things I spent quite a bit of time on this year, picking through, and actually I read almost every word of, is The Essential Reader's Companion. And this is a book that is really helpful if you want to get into the Star Wars books, because basically it lists and provides a brief description of the contents of all the novels. Now, I read it last summer, I should say a summer and a half ago, if that makes sense, summer and a half ago. And so obviously it wouldn't contain any of the books written more recently than about 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm not sure when they're going to come up with a new edition of that. I've also read this year Dawn of the Jedi, most of the Dawn of the Jedi. Why didn't I finish it? Just one of those occasions where you kind of forget about it or whatever. I read most of Kenobi this year. And I didn't like it that much, unfortunately. And read most of the Tales from Mos Eisley Cantina, and most of The Legends of Luke Skywalker. This is a more recent book, and it's a lesser known one, but it's really good. Anyway, I haven't quite finished it yet. All right, so the best and the worst of my reading this year, and I suppose more than a year, maybe the last 2 years. The best, Revan. Okay, Revan is situated in it's the Old Republic storyline, so there's other books that relate to it. So Darth Revan's story, or Revan's story, is very elaborate. There's many elements of it. It's really fleshed out quite well. So the Revan book has antecedents, and it is an awesome book. So it was the best book I've read recently, best Star Wars book I've read recently. And the reason is, I find that this book really taps into something very fundamental about what makes the whole mythos of the Force great. Okay, so I think that's what attracts people to Star Wars mostly. Yeah, it's an adventure story, but it's bigger than that. In a way, all the characters are agents of the Force. So whether the light side of the Force or the dark side, the primary actor in the Force, in the Star Wars books, is the Force. And all the people, they're not puppets. They're active participants. And that's one thing that I'll discuss later in another video about the relationship between Christian theology and George Lucas's idea of the Force, is that it's not puppetry. Okay, that the agents of the Force are still retain their freedom. At least the servants of the light side. The servants of the dark side, it's another matter, but it's not a black or white thing. So anyway, Revan, the book, is a really fascinating, especially the ending, which I won't spoil for you, the way in which the ideas of self-sacrifice, the ideas of the power of evil and the powers of good, makes Revan, well, the best of the Star Wars books I've read recently. Second best, the Darth Bane trilogy. Now, Darth Bane, is super interesting to see his progression from basically just this kind of low-life kind of guy whose life is not going anywhere, and to become a powerful Sith. Now, he's famous now in Star Wars, in the movies, as the guy who institutes the rule of two. There can only be two Sith, a master who holds the power and the apprentice who craves the power. So all that idea, which we see in the prequel series, traces itself back to Darth Bane and how he came up with it and why it's a good idea, right, in terms of the interests of the Sith. After the Darth Bane trilogy, again, let me just reemphasize, awesome books. And when people look at the Star Wars movies and the mess that they've made up of the sequel trilogy, you look at the comparison and you say, well, Darth Bane trilogy of books, these would have made an awesome movies. And they would have, absolutely. Okay, so after the Darth Bane trilogy, Darth Plagueis, awesome book. And it's one that, of course, people reference all the time to explain basically all the plan of Darth Plagueis and how he was carrying forth the plans of the Sith had been fulminating for centuries, and basically all the background stuff. So one of the most surprising facts, of course, that's not portrayed in the movie at all, and that famous scene where the Emperor asks, or I shouldn't say the Emperor, the Chancellor asks Anakin, have you ever heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? And the fact was that we know from this novel that Palpatine just killed Darth Plagueis. Days before, very soon, but it strikes me as just days before he has that conversation with Anakin. So, and it supplies lots of information about and a lot of speculation, for instance, who are Rey's parents in the the trilogy, in the sequel trilogy. I'm not sure, but the whole mirror thing that happened in the second movie, in the Last Jedi, it looks like it's suggesting that Rey is a clone. That was the thing that Darth Sidious's master, Darth Plagueis, he was really involved in trying to clone, himself so that he would have immortality, and that this is an operating theory about why Palpatine's going to make his appearance in The Rise of Luke Skywalker, and who Rey's parents were, so all that stuff, all the messing around that Darth Plagueis did in his laboratory to make himself immortal, so to speak, all that stuff is background provided by this novel, which is excellent. After Darth Plagueis, The Lost Tribe of the Sith is my fourth favorite. And again, it concentrates on the Sith again. So I should say, like, not all the good books are about the Sith, because Revan is about Revan as a Jedi, not as a Sith. So now we'll deal with the worst of the books. I'll go from best of the worst to the worst of the worst. How about? So Kenobi is the third worst book that I've read, and it's just bad. I shouldn't say it's bad. It's just not as great because it's kind of boring. It doesn't shed a whole lot of light on Obi-Wan, what he was doing on Tatooine all those years watching Luke Skywalker. It doesn't shed any more light than what's already being provided by various comics and so on. So it's just kind of boring. Now the second worst, Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. This is an older book, and its only weakness, of course, is that it doesn't add a lot to the lore, right? Just like Kenobi doesn't. It doesn't add a lot to the lore. And it's just kind of like, it gets a little redundant because it's just looking at the famous cantina scene from A New Hope, just from a whole bunch of different perspectives. It's a little tedious in that sense. Now, the worst one was the new book, newish book, in the last couple of years, From a Certain Point of View. Again, 10% of these stories were really good, 10% were really poor, and the 80% were just, whatever. And it's superior to the Tales from Mos Eisley in the sense that it takes a broader look at different perspectives on those key events from the original trilogy, but some of them are just very poor. I mean, so I don't highly recommend it. In fact, I recommend you not wasting your time on it. So anyway, I hope you maybe got something out of that, my perspective on the books, and I'll try to have some more thoughtful commentaries on future novels and maybe look at specific novels in more detail in future videos. So thanks guys for listening, and may the Force be with you.